become humanity, the epicenter of ideas surrounding transformative change that will revolutionize the way our world interacts with technology.
Back. This is part two of our discussion with Alan Lubitz. We're going to continue our discussion in going into more of the people-centric themes that help to drive organizational innovation, right? Yeah, and I think when you and I had a conversation around this topic prior, one of the things that stood out to me was the example you used in terms of focusing on the happy path, right? I think if we look at a lot of engineering projects, there's a lot of time that gets spent dealing with all the edge case scenarios because that is what takes up so much time. And that's the thing that I think most technical teams get called out on, is if they've missed some edge scenario that they didn't plan for, and then something can't continue on, right? And so this notion of really spending time on the happy path and refining the happy path and really making sure that that's optimal, even if it's somewhat counterintuitive, I think was really interesting. And I think the example you had referred to is the way that the stimulus checks were being distributed right now.
Right.
And so I think that was a fascinating example that you drew on. It would be interesting if you can share that analogy, and how is it tied to kind of happy path approaches to software?
What I was thinking about with these stimulus checks was that the most important political objective and human objective here was to put money into people's hands as quickly as possible. Now, in normal government problem solving, you try to figure out how to make sure it's 100% accurate before you launch it. But in this case, they said, okay, let's look at the 2018 taxes, I believe. That's how they determined whether people are eligible. And then they used the most current address that you'd had on the most current tax return you had filed. Now, we know that since a person filed their tax return last time, and now many people move. So some of those checks went to the wrong address, and many of them just automatically got forwarded because people had their forwarding address with the post office. Of course, the news outlets, they found the one person who didn't get their check, that didn't
Right.
keep pace with them. And those people had to then sit on a phone line waiting to be dealt with, for hours and hours, So they're definitely gonna be your exception cases. But here's a classic kind of one of your like 80-20 rule sort of examples where a government entity said, okay, look, we're just gonna make sure we put the money into people's hands as quickly as possible. And yes, we'll deal with some exceptions, but we're not gonna wait to solve all those exceptions. Let's get moving on it. So I was very actually impressed. That doesn't mean that people aren't gonna complain.
Right.
But, in a government problem, though, that's pretty good.
Yeah. No, I thought that was a really interesting correlation, right? In terms of happy path, because I just, that to me stuck out of like, how much time do we spend happy path and really start to refine to make it from happy to delight, right? To your example of delighting the user at the end. And I think a lot of those things get missed by edge case focus, right? And so to me,
I will say it's backfired on me, though. I have often pitched to business users to solve a problem, an 80-20 kind of an approach. But there's something inherent in the end user human psyche that they rarely give you the easy case to solve. When you say, hey, we came up with this solution and we did it faster than has ever been done before, and here it is, their first reaction is to say, okay, well, what happens with this really complicated one here? And that's what they hand you. They don't say, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful that you guys solved 80% of my problem here. Thank you.
Right.
They find the edge case that it doesn't work. So there have definitely been projects where I have had the 80-20 part of it built really fast, but we've had to hold back launching because we needed to build out the remaining part of the solution. And unfortunately, just some of them just are like that.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think I want to move on, because I love how you broke up these themes, right? You had the first three that were business related, and the last two that were more people and team related. So why don't we continue on and go through the other core themes that you've discussed, and let's cover the people side of this story.
Well, the first of those two is being able to handpick a team, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. And then the second one is about a suspension of the normal rules, and it really ties into our rebate checks, our stimulus check example, where a lot of things that have happened during this crisis, governments have stepped up and have suspended normal process. They've been able to accelerate, like the Congress has passed these stimulus bills very quickly. Normally, these are things that would take months or years and a lot of debating and a lot of posturing, but they cut through it.
Mhm.
And it's exciting. I think it's exciting for them as much as anybody to be able to see that they actually can govern and they can
Mhm.
make decisions quickly and imperfectly, but with great speed. And I've seen so many examples in my life, so many projects that have been proposed to me, something that the business met all my other criteria. It was very important, really complex. And my response back is, I want to handpick the team, and I want to be freed of all these other normal requirements so that we can be the most highly efficient team as possible. And I think there are probably many, many examples. If you look at the history of the evolution of microcomputing, the invention of the
Mhm.
Apple computer, of Windows, of other things, where there are great documentaries done on this kind of maverick, anarchistic kind of a group that gets formed, where people are passionately wrapped around this idea: we're going to solve this really hard problem, and no, the rules don't apply to us. We're in our own building. We
Mhm.
dress funny. We have shorthand for everything. We are irreverent, and I find that really energizing. So I can kind of cover either of those two or both if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I think the one thing I'd love to hear your talk about is how do you handpick that right team? I mean, I just happen to be, I feel like I'm the last person to read the Steve Jobs, Walter Isaacson's autobiography. And
Great book.
literally, I just finished this morning on a run listening to the portion of the book that talks about the Mac team getting assembled, like the original Macintosh team, right? And how Steve Jobs was directly involved with driving that team, and how much they were able to innovate and how they were able to be a small, lean team and kind of their principles, right? So a lot of what you're saying right now that is essential around teaming for driving innovation. So I'm really curious to understand, how do you approach building that right team, and what are some of the core principles that you look to infuse into that group?
Well, first, let me just mention another example, because the Apple example is a great one. There was an example just recently here how GM constructed the ventilators, and how they were able to really get it done in a matter of weeks. This is something that probably under normal circumstances would have taken at least months, if not years. And it was there was a gentleman who was about to retire just this week, and he is a quality guy, and he decided that he would stick around to see this one through. And they handpicked a team. I think it was about 48 people. So this wasn't about taking their factories with tens of thousands of people and converting them into ventilator factories. It was really taking one relatively small space, getting 48 people and cranking through and finding the right partner and getting it going. And so they have common themes to them. What I look for is, obviously you have a certain skill set that you need. But if you, let's say in my insurance example before, if you need someone who knows underwriting, well, there's probably 1,000, 2,000 people in your company who know a lot about underwriting. Of those couple thousand people, who are also really good at thinking out of the box, when it's the nature of a person who does underwriting to actually follow rules. The whole
Mhm.
job is about following the underwriting guidelines. So how do you, in a group like that, find somebody who can think a bit more anarchistically, more creatively, more out of the box? And you look for people who have already demonstrated this sort of living at the edge of experimentation, trying things. Some things worked, some things didn't work. They learn quickly. What's the expression, the Silicon Valley expression, fail fast. They try it, they fail quickly, they move on. So I looked for people who I had seen examples where they had experimented, tried, course corrected, come back and moved quickly and
Mhm.
came up with those 80-20 solutions. You look for people who can be both, are comfortable leading and speaking up, but also following and being a member of a team. And it's really, really hard to find people like that, because you can find the leaders and you can find the followers, but having people who know which gear to put themselves into at a given moment is much more challenging. And when it isn't their idea, can they still get behind it 100+% as much as if it was their own idea? And so looking for those people, and I do believe there's that expression, tone from the top.
Mm-hmm.
When you form a team like that, whether it's Steve Jobs or whether it's somebody like me, you've got to know how to corral that team, motivate them, get them on the same page. And there's a famous, I believe it's one of the Shakespearean plays where I think it's King Richard, where he has to give the impassioned speech to get this wild band of marauders to behave in a certain way and go save the village. And he gives this impassioned speech about these are our wives and our children and our family that are going to be attacked. And he makes it very personal for them.
Mm-hmm.
And now they are willing to risk their own lives to go fight the battle. But if you don't get people that excited and that motivated, they'll say, oh, this is getting hard, I can go do something else, or I'm not going to give it 100%. So that motivation, that setting, again, kind of making it like, that whole message of, hey, nobody's ever done this before, and if we ever pull this off, it's going to be the coolest thing, and
Right.
getting that excitement level going. So it's, finding those kind of people and keeping it small. I'm a big believer in small teams. There's a famous quote about, how there's only a small band of believers who could make something happen, because that's the only thing that's only ever worked. I do think you need a small team. But if I can, I'd like to touch on this thing about the elimination of the normal rules. Are you okay?
Right.
Going
Yeah,
there?
please. Yeah, please share.
I had the kind of a rare privilege to work with several icons in industry, people who were in the 90, 100-year-old kind of category. They've been extremely successful. And I found an interesting common theme in these people was that they loved a challenge. They loved to fight, kind of, that's what got them excited. Normal, ordinary business didn't excite them. They loved accomplishing something that had never been done before, or, like, for instance, when I worked at H&R Block with Henry Block, or with George Joseph at Mercury, or others, there's many others I could name. And the other thing was, like, for instance, Simon Ramo at TRW, the R of TRW, he told me that if it hadn't been for his insistence that all rules were basically set aside, he doesn't believe he could have been successful at developing the ballistic missile, the intercontinental ballistic missile for the United States. That was early in my career. But I heard this, and so I asked him more questions. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I told them they wanted us to build this, so we were in control. We were in the driver's seat. We said, okay, we'll do it if all the normal red tape and bureaucracy and reports and oversight and all these things, if those get put aside, and we have this lean team, often one location, running as fast as possible, trying to deliver this. And it has a lot of similarities to what our current crisis that we're seeing in some of these little steps that people have had to take. I love it when there's a project that important that people are willing to get rid of some of the normal noise and let you be extremely focused and efficient.
So I've got a question for you, Alan, given that, I want to lead into your fifth theme, right? How you're, as an IT leader, how do you come into an organization or move up in an organization and establish that level of autonomy, right? When innovation and kind of thinking about the future for that organization centers around a technology push, how do they carve out that space and get that autonomy with the right team? What is the secret sauce of making that happen?
Well, let me give you a couple of answers. The first one is, I'll use another example. I think it has to be part of your DNA that you like taking these kinds of things on. So,
Okay.
For example, I'll give you an example from years ago. I was working with a business executive, and he was just sort of making an offhand comment about a problem that they had. and it's been plaguing them for years. And I remember I was young and single then, and I went to Zuma Beach, and we were there on on a nice sunny day. And as I was laying there, you'd think I'd be thinking about other things, but that problem kept gnawing at me, and it hit me a way to solve it. The particular problem had to do with headcount management, and I realized what the flaw was in the argument. And so I went to him and I said, would you be willing to let me try to solve this problem? So it wasn't necessarily in my job description. I certainly wasn't at the level that would have been assigned a problem of this nature, but I raised my hand. So I do think that part of it is you have to raise your hand. You have to be willing to step into really uncomfortable and awkward and potentially career damaging projects, but also career making projects if you succeed. And I guess you have to have enough confidence that you can take it on. But if you're very risk averse, these are not for you. So that'd be the number one thing is I've got to say, you got to have a risk profile that allows you to say, I'm not afraid of taking on this problem, and I'm going to do it. And if it's career ending here, then I will go do something else.
Okay.
The second thing is I think there are ways to build up like a groundswell of support for a particular kind of a problem. So for example, one of the things I love to do is every year I like to do a planning session with each business unit. And we get their top team together, and the way I run the exercise is, and not just me, but other members of my team, but this is the model I like to use, is first we talk about looking out 10 years. And I have to tell you, 10-year lookouts are very, very difficult for people working in a corporate environment. They're difficult for anybody. It's difficult if you say to yourself, as a person, as a human being, where would you like to see yourself in 10 years? Not an easy question.
Right.
So when they struggle with that 10-year question, I say to them, like, where do you want your department? Where do you want these systems? Where do you want things? I say, where do you think your competitors will be in 10 years? And surprisingly, they can answer that more easily than they can answer where they want to see themselves. So we go through that dialogue. And usually the competitor is so much smarter than everybody else in this model, right?
Right.
So then you come back to, and you say, okay, well, if they're going to do those really brilliant things, why can't we do those really brilliant things? And it's surprisingly, when you look at their faces, to see this aha moment that, like, I guess there really isn't any reason why we couldn't be the ones that do that. Okay, so now you have sort of a 10-year vision of someplace you'd like to be. I mean, let's say right now it takes you 2 hours to process something, and you want to get that to 2 minutes, and you think your competitors are going to do it. You say, okay, well, now you start to say, well, what would it take in 10 years for us to get to the 2-minute process? And then you back it off a bit. And you say, okay, well, where would we have to be in 7 years, in 5 years? Now the exercise gets easier. When you're in the 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, 1 year exercise, you start breaking down a bigger, lofty goal into the component parts that you can actually deliver on. By the time you get to your 1 year goal, you can say, okay, well, if we just get this data cleaned up, or if we just, improve this one particular process or whatever, that's a great big step towards this longer term goal. And then if the road happens to change, the road path changes a little bit in your outlook, you still have built a foundational element that gets you closer to these objectives. So that was a long way of saying it, but I start by getting this groundswell of support and excitement, because it now has this vision that they see. The immediate task now ties into something bigger. And then if you say, okay, now we need to go sell this to the broader business community to get funding for this thing that you want to do. So you have to help us create this storyline that other people can understand. You have to show why this one step makes good sense. And you have to put it in business terms that is hard for IT people to do, for example. You got to put it in terms of what's the revenue you're going to get, the increased revenue, or the increased market share you're going to gain, or the cost reduction that you're going to get. And by taking it, now that they've got kind of the vision and the broken down component pieces that they want, now starting to build that exercise is the next hard thing. And then lastly, you have to bring in good numbers people who can help turn it into a good pro forma for you, so that you can now talk in the language of not only business, but of finance. Because it may require investment dollars that you have to go do a fundraise or a venture capital round, or you might have to borrow money or do something like that. You certainly have to compete for the company's capital. So
Right.
get into vision and components, into business case, and now financial analysis. You now have the tools that you need to go pitch it. And then I think lastly, I would say you take a lesson from the startups. They do all that. When you're in a startup, I've done them. I can tell you, you have to do all those. You have to build this great vision. You have to turn it into an elevator pitch. You have to then know what are the pieces. Because if, let's say you do get let's say you're going after the $1 million, do you spend it first on getting a really nice facility, printing business cards for everyone, doing all that? Or do you solve the one core problem with the few limited dollars that you have, or get the key people on board? And these are trade-offs that you have to make, and the ones who make it correctly succeed and the ones who don't fail. So I think it's that process of working together with the business community and blurring the lines so that it isn't starkly an IT group, for example, and a business group. It's one team of cross-functional people with a mission who are now passionately selling it and saying, we're not going to take no for an answer. We're going to go make this happen, and we're going to deliver on it and do something that's a bit unprecedented.
I love that. That's like a really good path, I would believe, Alan. Like you've laid out a really good journey that one would need to go to in order to make sure that they have that risk reward scenario and line everything up. I think the one thing that I would want to, I would need to ask, because I think it's so critical for so many IT leaders in this rapidly changing business environment right now, is how do they get a grasp on that vision? What are some steps that you think leaders should start to think about in technology to help to develop a vision level understanding of how they can help their organizations chart a course towards the future?
Well, I don't want to repeat myself on the visioning exercise. I do believe that there's three elements that I can think of. One is you have to work together with the business folks to understand their vision in business terms. Second, I think you have to look for other examples in the world that may be leading indicators of what you should be doing, so that you're now a contributor of bringing ideas to those business people. So, for example, if they just see doing what they currently do faster, let's say, for example, let's say you've got to move a pile of stones from on a native island that has never seen current population and current technology. You've got to move a pile of rocks from point A to point B. Now, they're going to think in very simple terms of, I got to throw more manpower at it to be able to lift more rocks, to be able to move them as fast as possible. Well, since you've seen what an earth mover looks like, you might say, well, maybe we should go get one of those earth movers, bring it over here. Now, admittedly, it's going to cost some money and it's going to take a while to get it here. But in about 5 minutes, it's going to move that pile of rocks from point A to point B. And while that's happening and unfolding, we can focus on something else. Because why were you moving the rocks anyhow? So you're probably going to build something. So let's focus on figuring out how to build it. So my specific example is a lot of times in non-retail businesses, for example, I'll bring up retail examples. You see a lot of customization and a lot of choice and selection, and like in a clothing retail website, they might have the ability to take your picture of yourself and now overlay the clothes and try things on virtually. Well, you might think, well, that has nothing to do with my business because I'm more B2B. Well, when you break it down, there are things. There are like what if scenarios. In my example before of insurance, well, what if I buy this car versus this car? Or there are a lot of what ifs. What if I reduce my miles driven, or what if I move to another location to be closer to work, or into a different zip code? I mean, there's all these different what ifs you can play. So there are ways to build more consumer-friendly tools And the question is, if you're, let's say, a B2B business, is it in your interest to go build something like that? So I would tend to bring up capabilities that are out there. I'll give you a good example.
I like that. I like that. It's
I had
interesting.
a business person came to me wanting to go from cassette recording of interviews, claims interviews. They wanted to go to handheld digital recorders because you know what I'm talking about. There's the ones
Yep,
that have
yep.
cassettes in them, other ones, because we were actually recording it, putting it on a cassette, putting the cassette tape into a file folder and sticking it in a file cabinet.
Okay.
So he wanted to, he had some vision. He wanted to go to digital, which made good sense to him. Well, it turns out that what I suggested was that, I think our phone system has the ability to capture recordings. So why don't we find if there's a way to modify that? So we worked with a company that did the recording technology on our phones that we were already using for quality control purposes. Like when it says this
Yeah.
call will be recorded for quality purposes. And we said, okay, can we put like a start and an end spot in that recording and actually capture that snip? And it took a little bit of work with the company to have them build these couple of extra little things there, but it was probably a matter of weeks rather than months. And now we had this ability, right? We put it into the screen. This is okay, when you're ready to start the recorded interview, click this button on here. And then when you end the recording, and it's flashing away just like a recording would do. And then when you're done, click it to end the recording, and then that snip will be saved and everything else will eventually be thrown away. So it was just coming up, because we are more aware of, let's say, the technical possibilities, it was offering those in to the business problem so that people could be aware of more choices. And I think that I think is you can get a combination of that by looking at first the outside of your own industry, and then secondly by keeping up on the latest technology trends and saying, how can I apply that? So to recap, it was working with the business on their vision, looking outside of your industry for other options, and number three is keeping up on the cool technology trends, what startups are doing, and bringing those ideas to the business people. Say, hey, what if we use drones to deliver things? What if we did physical inspections of the roof of a house by sending a drone up there? Wouldn't that be cool?
Right.
That's, I think, the combination.
I love that. That's extremely helpful. I think that those like tidbits are extremely valuable, especially, I mean, I wouldn't have thought about it, especially because I've spent so much time in B2B thinking about looking at retail as a source of inspiration. That's a really interesting idea that I think a lot of people may not have initially gravitated to in B2B world. Right. So
I can give you an example. When I worked for a mortgage company, we were direct to consumer. And one of the things I implemented at that time was electronic signatures, being able to e-sign. Well, now we're so used to doing e-signing, but it was really novel at the time, and it was complicated, and there were a lot of vendors, and the solutions were less than perfect. This is quite a long time ago. When I got into the insurance business, they weren't doing e-signature, and so I became a strong advocate for it, and the business people didn't want it. So I then had to figure out, I had to find somebody who was passionate enough as much as I was, and then I had to find an agent, an end user who was passionate about it, and we had to find a way together to try to do a small version of it, and not, some people do that secretly. I did it very overtly. I got buy-in from the management team here. A very small, inexpensive experiment. As a matter of fact, the first mobile site that we did was all based on a request I had made to our management. I said, just give me a small amount of money. I think it was maybe $25,000. And let me just go build a mobile website and just see what we can do. And I did the same thing with voice technology not that long ago. Very small amount of money. I actually happen to believe that too much money thrown at a problem like this becomes a problem. You want to keep it extremely lean, and that really boosts the creativity of the team. And then you come in and you say, hey, here's an initial success. Can we have a little bit more money to now see if we can take it to the next level and to the next level?
Right. I've seen that time and time again. The more money you throw at the initial, the more complex it becomes, for sure. Well, this is really helpful, Alan. I cannot thank you enough. I think, the 5 themes that you've ran through in terms of applying innovative approaches within organizations is extremely beneficial for our guests. So given that that's all the time that we have for today, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think you've added a tremendous amount of value to our guests. And I also want to recognize our listeners and thank you for tuning in. I hope you've gained some valuable knowledge today. Please subscribe if you haven't already and send us any feedback and ideas you'd like to see in future shows. With that being said, I want to give everybody a heads up to tune in on March 12th. We will have Neil Sahota, an IBM Master Inventor, with us. Also part of the United Nations AI subject matter expert and faculty at UC Irvine. So he'll be joining us on March 12th. I'm your host, Kevin Castle, and you've been listening to Humanity. Thank you very much.